Relax and listen to the voice. Hey everybody, subscribe to the channel, like the videos, and enjoy yourselves. We present you with Hans Christian Andersen's Fairy Tales, Volume 4. Here we go. The Emperor's New Suit. Many, many years ago lived an emperor who thought so much of his new clothes that he spent all of his money in order to obtain them. His only ambition was to be always well dressed. He did not care for his soldiers, and the theater did not amuse him. The only thing, in fact, he thought anything of was to drive out and show a new suit of clothes. He had a coat for every hour of the day, and as one would say of a king, he is in his cabinet. So one could say of him, the emperor is in his dressing room. The great city where he resided was very gay. Every day, many strangers from all parts of the globe arrived. One day, 2 swindlers came into the city, and they made people believe that they were weavers and declared that they could manufacture the finest cloth to be imagined. Their colors and patterns, they said, were not only exceptionally beautiful, but the clothes made of their material possessed the wonderful quality of being invisible to any man who was unfit for his office or unpardonably stupid.
That must be a wonderful cloth, thought the emperor. If I were to be dressed in a suit made of this cloth, I should be able to find out which men in my empire were unfit for their places, and I could distinguish the clever from the stupid. I must have this cloth woven for me without delay.
So the emperor gave a large sum of money to the swindlers in advance that they should set to work without any loss of time. They set up 2 looms and pretended to be very hard at work, but they did nothing whatever on the looms. They asked for the finest silk and the most precious gold cloth. All they got they did away with, and worked at the empty looms until late at night.
I should very much like to know how they are getting on with the cloth,
thought the emperor, but he felt rather uneasy when he remembered that he who was not fit for his office could not see it. Personally, he was of opinion that he had nothing to fear, yet he thought it advisable to send somebody else first to see how matters stood. Everybody in the town knew what a remarkable quality the stuff possessed, and all were anxious to see how bad or stupid their neighbors were.
I shall send my honest old minister to the weavers, thought the emperor. He can judge best how the stuff looks, for he is intelligent, and nobody understands his office better than he.
The good old minister went into the room where the swindlers sat before the empty looms.
Heaven preserve us, he thought,
and he opened his eyes wide.
I cannot see anything at all.
But he did not say so. Both swindlers requested him to come near, and asked him if he did not admire the exquisite pattern and the beautiful colors, while pointing to the empty looms. The poor minister tried his very best, but he could see nothing, for there was nothing to be seen.
Oh dear, he thought. Can I be so stupid? I should never have thought so, and nobody must know it. Is it possible that I'm not fit for my office? No, I cannot say that I was unable to see the cloth.
Now, have you got nothing to say? Said one of the swindlers while he pretended to be busily weaving.
Oh, it's very pretty, exceedingly beautiful,
replied the old minister, looking through his glasses.
What a beautiful pattern! What brilliant colors! I shall tell the emperor that I like the cloth very much.
We're very pleased to hear that, said the 2 weavers, and described to him the colors and explained the curious pattern. The old minister listened attentively, that he might relate to the emperor what they said, and so he did. Now the swindlers asked for more money, silk, and gold cloth, which they required for weaving. They kept everything for themselves, and not a thread came near the loom, but they continued, as hitherto, to work at the empty looms. Soon afterwards, the emperor sent another honest courtier to the weavers to see how they were getting on, and if the cloth was nearly finished. Like the old minister, he looked and looked, but could see nothing, as there was nothing to be seen.
"Is it not a beautiful piece of cloth?"
asked the two swindlers, showing and explaining the magnificent pattern which, however, did not exist.
"I'm not stupid," said the man. "It is therefore my good appointment for which I am not fit. It is very strange, but I must not let anyone know it."
And so he praised the cloth, which he did not see, and expressed his joy at the beautiful colors and the fine pattern.
"It is very excellent," he said to the emperor.
Everybody in the whole town talked about the precious cloth. At last, the emperor wished to see it himself while it was still on the loom. With a number of courtiers, including the two who had already been there, he went to the two clever swindlers, who now worked as hard as they could, but without using any thread.
"Is it not magnificent?"
said the two old statesmen who had been there before.
"Your Majesty must admire the colors and the pattern."
And then they pointed to the empty looms, for they imagined that the others could see the cloth.
"What is this?"
thought the emperor.
"I do not see anything at all. Oh, that is terrible. Am I stupid? Am I unfit to be emperor? That would indeed be the most dreadful thing that could happen to me." "Really," he said, turning to the weavers, "your cloth has our most gracious approval."
And nodding contentedly, he looked at the empty loom, for he did not like to say that he saw nothing. All his attendants who were with him looked and looked, and although they could not see anything more than the others, they said, like the emperor, "It is very beautiful," and all advised him to wear the new magnificent clothes at a great procession which was soon to take place.
"It is magnificent, beautiful, excellent,"
one heard them say. Everyone seemed to be delighted, and the emperor appointed the two swindlers imperial court weavers. The whole night previous to the day on which the procession was to take place, the swindlers pretended to work and burned more than 16 candles. People should see that they were busy to finish the emperor's new suit. They pretended to take the cloth from the loom and worked about it in the air with big scissors and sewed with needles without thread, and said at last, "The emperor's new suit is ready now." The emperor and all his barons then came to the hall. The swindlers held their arms up as if they held something in their hands and said, "These are the trousers, and this is the coat, and here is the cloak," and so on and so on. "They're all as light as a cobweb, and one must feel as if one had nothing at all upon the body, but that is just the beauty of them." "Indeed," said all the courtiers, but they could not see anything, for there was nothing to be seen. "Does it please your Majesty now to graciously undress," said the swindlers, "that we may assist your Majesty in putting on the new suit before the large looking-glass?" The emperor undressed, and the swindlers pretended to put the new suit upon him, one piece after another, and the emperor looked at himself in the glass from every side. "How well they look! How well they fit!" said all. "What a beautiful pattern! What fine colors! That is a magnificent suit of clothes!" The master of the ceremonies announced that the bearers of the canopy, which was to be carried into the procession, were ready. "I am ready," said the emperor. "Does my suit not fit me marvelously?" Then he turned once more to the looking-glass, that people should think that he admired his garments. The chamberlains, who were to carry the train, stretched their hands to the ground as if they lifted up the train, and pretended to hold something in their hands. They did not like people to know that they could not see anything. The emperor marched in a procession under the beautiful canopy, and all who saw him in the street and out of the windows exclaimed, "Indeed, the emperor's new suit is incomparable! What a long train he has! How well it fits him!" Nobody wished to let others know that he saw nothing, for then he would have been unfit for his office, or too stupid. Never emperor's clothes were more admired.
"But he has nothing on at all,"
said a little child at last.
"Good heavens! Listen to the voice of an innocent child,"
said the father, and one whispered to the other what the child had said.
"But he has nothing on at all,"
cried at last the whole of the people. That made a deep impression upon the emperor, for it seemed to him that they were right. But he thought to himself,
"Now I must bear up to the end."
And the chamberlains walked with still greater dignity, as if they carried the train which did not exist. The Galoshes of Fortune. A beginning. In a house in Copenhagen, not far from the King's New Market, a very large party had assembled, the host and his family expecting, no doubt, to receive invitations in return. One half of the company were already seated at the card tables. The other half seemed to be waiting the result of their hostess's question.
"Well, how shall we amuse ourselves?"
Conversation followed, which, after a while, began to prove very entertaining. Among other subjects, it turned upon the events of the Middle Ages, which some persons maintained were more full of interest than our own times. Councillor Knapp defended this opinion so warmly that the lady of the house immediately went over to his side and both exclaimed against Oersted's essays on ancient and modern times, in which the preference is given to our own. The councillor considered the times of the Danish king, Hans, as the noblest and happiest. The conversation on this topic was only interrupted for a moment by the arrival of a newspaper, which did not, however, contain much worth reading, and while it is still going on, we will pay a visit to the anteroom, in which cloaks, sticks, and galoshes were carefully placed. Here sat two maidens, one young and the other old, as if they had come and were waiting to accompany their mistresses home, but on looking at them more closely, it could easily be seen that they were no common servants. Their shapes were too graceful, their complexions too delicate, and the cut of their dresses much too elegant. They were two fairies. The younger was not Fortune herself, but the chambermaid of one of Fortune's attendants, who carries about her more trifling gifts. The elder one, who was named Care, looked rather gloomy. She always goes about to perform her business in person, for then she knows it is properly done. They were telling each other where they had been during the day. The messenger of Fortune had only transacted a few unimportant matters. For instance, she had preserved a new bonnet from a shower of rain, and obtained for an honest man a bow from a titled nobody, and so on. But she had something extraordinary to relate after all.
"I must tell you,"
said she,
"that today is my birthday, and in honor of it I have been entrusted with a pair of galoshes to introduce amongst mankind. These galoshes have the property of making everyone who puts them on imagine himself in any place he wishes, or that he exists at any period. Every wish is fulfilled at the moment it is expressed, so that for once mankind have the chance of being happy." "No,"
replied Care.
"you may depend upon it that whoever puts those galoshes on will be very unhappy, and bless the moment in which he can get rid of them." "What are you thinking of?"
replied the other.
"Now see, I will place them by the door. Someone will take them instead of his own, and he will be a happy man."
And this was the end of their conversation. What happened to the counselor? It was late when Counselor Knapp, lost in thought about the times of King Hans, desired to return home, and fate so ordered it that he put on the Galoshes of Fortune instead of his own, and walked out into the East Street. Through the magic power of the galoshes, he was at once carried back 300 years to the times of King Hans, for which he had been longing when he put them on. Therefore, he immediately set his foot into the mud and mire of the street, which in those days possessed no pavement.
"Why, this is horrible! How dreadfully dirty it is!"
said the counselor.
"And the whole pavement has vanished, and the lamps are all out."
The moon had not yet risen high enough to penetrate the thick foggy air, and all the objects around him were confused together in the darkness. At the nearest corner, a lamp hung before a picture of the Madonna, but the light it gave was almost useless, for he only perceived it when he came quite close, and his eyes fell on the painted figures of the mother and child.
"That is most likely a museum of art," thought he, "and they have forgotten to take down the sign."
Two men in the dress of olden times passed by him.
"What odd figures!" thought he. "They must be returning from some masquerade."
Suddenly he heard the sound of a drum and fifes, and then a blazing light from torches shone upon him. The counselor stared with astonishment as he beheld a most strange procession pass before him. First came a whole troop of drummers, beating their drums very cleverly. They were followed by lifeguards, with longbows and crossbows. The principal person in this procession was a clerical-looking gentleman. The astonished counselor asked what it all meant, and who the gentleman might be.
"Why, that is the Bishop of Zealand."
"Good gracious!"
he exclaimed.
"What in the world has happened to the bishop? What can he be thinking about?"
And then he shook his head and said,
"It cannot possibly be the bishop himself."
While musing upon this strange affair, and without looking to the right or left, he walked on through East Street and over High Bridge Place. The bridge, which he supposed led to Palace Square, was nowhere to be found, but instead he saw a bank and some shallow water, and two people who sat in a boat.
Does the gentleman wish to be ferried over the Holme?"
asked one of the men.
"To the Holme,"
explained the counselor, not knowing in what age he was now existing.
"I want to go to Christian's Haven in Little Turf Street."
The men stared at him.
"Pray tell me where the bridge is,"
said he.
"It is shameful that the lamps are not lighted here, and it is as muddy as if one were walking in a marsh."
But the more he talked with the boatmen, the less they could understand each other.
"I don't understand your outlandish talk,"
he cried at last, angrily turning his back upon them. He could not, however, find the bridge nor any railings.
"What a scandalous condition this place is in," said he.
Never certainly had he found his own time so miserable as on this evening.
"I think it will be better for me to take a coach. But where are they?"
There was not one to be seen.
"I shall be obliged to go back to the King's New Market," said he. where there are plenty of carriages standing, or I shall never reach Christian's Haven."
And then he went towards East Street, and he had nearly passed through it when the moon burst forth from a cloud.
"Dear me, what have they been erecting here?"
he cried, as he caught the sight of the East Gate, which in olden times used to stand at the end of East Street. However, he found an opening through which he passed, and came out upon where he expected to find the New Market. Nothing was to be seen but an open meadow, surrounded by a few bushes, through which ran a broad canal or stream. A few miserable-looking wooden booths for the accommodation of Dutch watermen stood on the opposite shore.
"Either I behold a Fata Morgana, or I must be tipsy," groaned the counselor. "What can it be? What is the matter with me?"
He turned back in the full conviction that he must be ill. In walking through the street this time, he examined the houses more closely, and he found that most of them were built on lath and plaster, and many had only a thatched roof.
"I am certainly all wrong," said he with a sigh. "And yet I only drank 1 glass of punch, but I cannot bear even that, and it was very foolish to give us punch and hot salmon. I shall speak about it to our hostess, the agent's lady. Suppose I were to go back now and say how ill I feel. I fear it would look so ridiculous, and it is not very likely that I should find anyone up."
And then he looked for the house, but it was not in existence.
"This is really frightful. I cannot even recognize East Street. Not a shop to be seen. Nothing but old, wretched, tumble-down houses, just as if I were at Roskilde or Ringstead. Oh, I really must be ill. It is no use to stand upon ceremony. But where in the world is the agent's house? There is a house, but it is not his, and people still up in it. I can hear. Oh dear, I certainly am very queer."
As he reached the half-open door, he saw a light and went in. It was a tavern of olden times, and seemed a kind of beer shop. The room had the appearance of a Dutch interior. A number of people, consisting of seamen, Copenhagen citizens, and a few scholars, sat in deep conversation over their mugs, and they took very little notice of the newcomer.
"Pardon me,"
said the counselor, addressing the landlady.
"I do not feel quite well, and I should be much obliged if you will send for a fly to take me to Christian's Haven."
The woman stared at him and shook her head. Then she spoke to him in German. The counselor supposed from this that she did not understand Danish. He therefore repeated his request in German. This, as well as his singular dress, convinced the woman that he was a foreigner. She soon understood, however, that he did not find himself quite well, and therefore brought him a mug of water. It had something of the taste of sea-water, certainly, although it had been drawn from the well outside. Then the counselor leaned his head on his hand, drew a deep breath, and pondered over all the strange things that had happened to him.
"Is that today's number of the day?" he asked, quite mechanically, as he saw the woman putting by a large piece of paper.
She did not understand what he meant, but she handed him the sheet. It was a woodcut representing a meteor, which had appeared in the town of Cologne.
"That is very old,"
said the counselor, becoming quite cheerful at the sight of this antique drawing.
"Where did you get this singular sheet? It is very interesting. Although the whole affair is a fable, meteors are easily explained in these days. They are northern lights, which are often seen and are no doubt caused by electricity."
Those who sat near him and heard what he said looked at him in great astonishment, and one of them rose, took off his hat respectfully, and said in a very serious manner, "You must certainly be a very learned man, monsieur."
"Oh, no," replied the counselor. "I can only discourse on topics which everyone should understand."
"Modestia is a beautiful virtue," said the man. "Moreover, I must add to your speech, mihi secis videtur. Yet in this case, I would suspend my judicum."
"May I ask to whom I have the pleasure of speaking?"
"I am a bachelor of divinity," said the man. This answer satisfied the counselor. The title agreed with the dress.
"This surely is," thought he, "an old village schoolmaster, a perfect original, such as one meets with sometimes even in Jutland."
"This is not certainly a locus docendi," began the man. "Still, I must beg you to continue the conversation. You must be well read in ancient lore."
"Oh, yes," replied the counselor. "I am very fond of reading useful old books, and modern ones as well, with the exception of everyday stories, of which we really have more than enough."
"Everyday stories?" asked the bachelor.
"Oh, yes, I mean the new novels that we have at the present day."
"Oh," replied the man with a smile. "And yet they are very witty, and are much read at court. The king likes especially the romance of the Monsieur Zephyrin and Godin, which describes King Arthur and his knights of the Round Table. He has joked about it with the gentlemen of his court."
"Well, I have certainly not read that," replied the counselor. "I suppose it is quite new, and published by Heiberg."
"No," answered the man. "It is not by Heiberg. Gottfried von Gehmen brought it out."
"Oh, is he the publisher? That is a very old name," said the counselor. "Was it not the name of the first publisher in Denmark?"
"Yes, and he is our first printer and publisher now," replied the scholar. So far all had passed off very well, but now one of the citizens began to speak of a terrible pestilence which had been raging a few years before, meaning the plague of 1484. The counselor thought that he referred to the cholera, and they could discuss this without finding out the mistake. The war in 1490 was spoken of as quite recent. The English pirates had taken some ships in the Channel in 1801, and the counselor, supposing they referred to these, agreed with them in finding fault with the English. The rest of the talk, however, was not so agreeable. Every moment one contradicted the other. The good bachelor appeared very ignorant, for the simplest remark of the counselor seemed to him either too bold or too fantastic. They stared at each other, and when it became worse, the bachelor spoke in Latin in the hope of being better understood, but it was all useless.
"Right, how are you now?"
asked the landlady, pulling the counselor's sleeve. And then his recollection returned to him. In the course of conversation, he had forgotten all that had happened previously.
"Goodness me, where am I?"
said he. It bewildered him as he thought of it.
"We will have some claret or mead or Bremen beer," said one of the guests. "Will you drink with us?"
Two maids came in. One of them had a cap on her head of two colors. They poured out the wine, bowed their heads, and withdrew. The counselor felt a cold shiver run all over him.
"What is this? What does it mean?"
said he, but he was obliged to drink with them, for they overpowered the good man with their politeness. He became at last desperate, and when one of them said he was tipsy, he did not doubt the man's word in the least, only begged them to get a droshky, and then they thought that he was speaking the Muscovite language. Never before had he been in such rough and vulgar company.
One might believe that this country was going back to heathenism, he observed. This is the most terrible moment of my life.
Just then it came into his mind that he would stoop under the table and so creep to the door. He tried it, but before he reached the entry, the rest discovered what he was about and seized him by the feet, when luckily for him, off came the galoshes, and with them vanished the whole enchantment. The counselor now saw quite plainly a lamp and a large building behind it. Everything looked familiar and beautiful. He was in East Street, as it now appears. He lay with his legs turned toward a porch, and just by him sat the watchman asleep.
Is it possible that I have been lying here in the street and dreaming? Said he. Yes, this is East Street. How beautifully bright and gay it looks. It is quite shocking that one glass of punch should have upset me like this.
2 minutes afterwards, he sat in a droshky, which was to drive him to Christian's Haven. He thought of all the terror and anxiety which he had undergone, and felt thankful from his heart for the reality and the comfort of modern times, which, with all of their errors, were far better than those in which he so lately found himself. The Watchman's Adventures.
Well, I declare there lies a pair of galoshes,
said the watchman.
No doubt they belong to the lieutenant who lives upstairs. They're lying just by his door.
Gladly would the honest man have rung and given them in, for a light was still burning, but he did not wish to disturb the other people in the house, so he let them lie.
These things must keep the feet very warm, said he. They are of such nice soft leather.
Then he tried them on, and they fitted his feet exactly.
Now, said he, how droll things are in this world. There's that man can lie down in his warm bed, but he does not do so. There he goes pacing up and down the room. He ought to be a happy man. He has neither wife or children, and he goes out into the company every evening. Oh, I wish I were he, and then I should be a happy man.
As he uttered this wish, the galoshes which he had put on took effect, and the watchman at once became the lieutenant. There he stood in his room, holding a little piece of pink paper between his fingers, on which was a poem written by the lieutenant himself. Who has not had, for once in his life, a moment of poetic inspiration? And at such a moment, if the thoughts are written down, they flow in poetry. The following verses were written on the pink paper. Oh, were I rich, how oft, in youth's bright hour, when youthful pleasures banish every care, I longed for riches, but to gain a power, the sword and plume and uniform to wear. The riches and the honor came from me, yet still my greatest wealth was poverty. Ah, help and pity me. Once, in my youthful hours, when gay and free, a maiden loved me, and her gentle kiss, rich in its tender love and purity, taught me, alas, too much of earthly bliss. Dear child, she only thought of youthful glee. She loved no wealth, but fairy tales and me. Thou knowest, ah, pity me. Oh, were I rich, again is all my prayer. That child is now a woman, fair and free, as good and beautiful as angels are. Oh, were I rich in lover's poetry, to tell my fairy tale, love's richest lore. But no, I must be silent. I am poor. Ah, wilt thou pity me? Oh, were I rich in truth and peace below, I need not then my poverty bewail. To thee I dedicate these lines of woe. Wilt thou not understand the mournful tale? A leaf on which my sorrows I relate, dark story of a darker night of fate. Ah, bless and pity me. Well, yes, people write poems when they are in love, but a wise man will not print them. A lieutenant in love and poor. This is a triangle, or more properly speaking, the half of the broken die of fortune. The lieutenant felt this very keenly, and therefore leaned his head against the window frame, and sighed deeply.
"The poor watchman in the street," said he, "is far happier than I am. He knows not what I call poverty. He has a home, a wife and children, who weep at his sorrow and rejoice at his joy. Oh, how much happier I should be could I change my being and position with him, and pass through life with his humble expectations and hopes. Yes, he is indeed happier than I am."
At this moment, the watchman again became a watchman, for having, through the galoshes of fortune, passed into the existence of the lieutenant, and found himself less contented than he expected, he had preferred his former condition, and wished himself again a watchman.
"That was an ugly dream," said he, "but droll enough. It seemed to me as if I were the lieutenant up yonder, but there was no happiness for me. I missed my wife and the little ones, who are always ready to smother me with kisses."
He sat down again and nodded, but he could not get the dream out of his thoughts, and he still had the galoshes on his feet. A falling star gleamed across the sky.
"Oh, there goes one!" cried he. "However, there are quite enough left. I should very much like to examine these a little nearer, especially the moon, for that could not slip away under one's hands. The student, for whom my wife washes, says that when we die, we shall fly from the one star to another. If that were true, it would be very delightful, but I don't believe it. I wish I could make a little spring up there now. I would willingly let my body lie here on the steps."
There are certain things in the world which should be uttered very cautiously. Doubly so when the speaker has on his feet the galoshes of fortune. Now we shall hear what happened to the watchman. Nearly everyone is acquainted with the great power of steam. We have proved it by the rapidity with which we can travel, both on a railroad or in a steamship across the sea. But this speed is like the movements of the sloth, or the crawling march of the snail, when compared to the swiftness with which light travels. Light flees 19 million times faster than the fleetest racehorse, and electricity is more rapid still. Death is an electric shock which we receive in our hearts, and on the wings of electricity the liberated soul flies away swiftly. The light from the sun travels to our earth 95 millions of miles in 8 minutes and a few seconds, but on the wings of electricity the mind requires only a second to accomplish the same distance. The space between the heavenly bodies is, to thought, no farther than the distance which we may have to walk from one friend's house to another in the same town. Yet this electric shock obliges us to use our bodies here below, unless, like the watchman, we have on the galoshes of fortune. In a very few seconds, the watchman had traveled more than 200 miles to the moon, which is formed of a lighter material than our Earth, and may be said to be as soft as new-fallen snow. He found himself on one of the circular range of mountains which we see represented in Dr. Madler's large map of the moon. The interior had the appearance of a large, hollow bowl shape with a depth about a half a mile from the brim. Within this hollow stood a large town. We may form some idea of its appearance by pouring the white of an egg into a glass of water. The materials of which it was built seemed just as soft, and pictured forth cloudy turrets and sail-like terraces, quite transparent and floating in the thin air. Our Earth hung over his head like a great dark red ball. Presently, he discovered a number of beings which might certainly be called men, but were very different to ourselves. A more fantastical imagination than Herschel's must have discovered these. Had they been placed in groups and painted, it might have been said, "What beautiful foliage!" They had also a language of their own. No one could have expected the soul of the watchman to understand it, and yet he did understand it, for our souls have much greater capabilities than we are inclined to believe. Do we not, in our dreams, show a wonderful dramatic talent? Each of our acquaintances appears to us, and then in his own character, with his own voice. No man could thus imitate them in his waking hours. How clearly, too, we are reminded of persons whom we have not seen for many years. They start up suddenly to the mind's eye with all their peculiarities as living realities. In fact, this memory of the soul is a fearful thing. Every sin, every sinful thought it can bring back, and we may well ask how we are to give account of every idle word that may have been whispered in the heart or uttered with the lips. The spirit of the watchman, therefore, understood very well the language of the inhabitants of the moon. They were disputing about our Earth, and doubted whether it could be inhabited. The atmosphere, they asserted, must be too dense for any inhabitants of the moon to exist there. They maintained that the moon alone was inhabited, and was really the heavenly body in which the old world people lived. They likewise talked about politics. But now we will descend to East Street and see what happens to the watchman's body. He sat lifeless on the steps. His staff had fallen out of his hand, and his eyes stared at the moon, about which his honest soul was wandering.
"What is it o'clock, watchman?"
inquired a passenger, but there was no answer from the watchman. The man then pulled his nose gently, which caused him to lose his balance. The body fell forward and lay at full length on the ground as one dead. All of his comrades were very much frightened, for he seemed quite dead, and still they allowed him to remain after they had given notice of what had happened, and at dawn the body was carried to the hospital. We might imagine it to be no jesting matter if the soul of the man should chance to return to him, for most probably it would seek for the body in East Street without being able to find it. We might fancy the soul inquiring of the police, or at the address office, or among the missing parcels, and then at length finding it at the hospital. But we may comfort ourselves by the certainty that the soul, when acting upon its own impulses, is wiser than we are. It is the body that makes it stupid. As we have said, the watchman's body had been taken to the hospital, and here it was placed in a room to be washed. Naturally, the first thing done here was to take off the galoshes, upon which the soul was instantly obliged to return, and it took the direct road to the body at once, and in a few seconds the man's life returned to him. He declared, when he quite recovered himself, that this had been the most dreadful night that he had ever passed, and not for £100 would he go through such feelings again. However, it was all over now. The same day he was allowed to leave, but the galoshes remained in the hospital. The eventful moment, a most unusual journey. Every inhabitant of Copenhagen knows what the entrance to Frederick's hospital is like, but as most probably a few of those who read this little tale may not reside in Copenhagen, we will give a short description of it. The hospital is separated from the street by an iron railing in which the bars stand so wide apart that it's said some very slim patients have squeezed through and gone on to pay little visits in the town. The most difficult part of the body to get through was the head, and in this case, as it often happens in the world, the small heads were the most fortunate. This will serve as sufficient introduction to our tale. One of the young volunteers, of whom, physically speaking, it might be said that he had a great head, was on guard that evening at the hospital. The rain was pouring down, yet, in spite of those two obstacles, he wanted to go out just for a quarter of an hour. It was not worthwhile, he thought, to make a confidant of the porter, as he could easily slip through the iron railings. There lay the galoshes, which the watchman had forgotten. It never occurred to him that these could be galoshes of fortune. They would be very serviceable to him in this rainy weather, so he drew them on. Now came the question whether he could squeeze through the palings. He certainly had never tried, so he stood looking at them.
"I wish to goodness my head was through,"
said he, and instantly, though it was so thick and large, it slipped through, and quite easily. The galoshes answered that purpose very well, but his body had to follow, and this was impossible.
"I'm too fat," he said. "I thought my head would be the worst, but I cannot get my body through, that is certain."
Then he tried to pull his head back again, but without success. He could move his neck about easily enough, and that was all. His first feeling was one of anger, and then his spirit sank below zero. The Galoshes of Fortune had placed him in this terrible position, and unfortunately, it never occurred to him to wish himself free. No, instead of wishing, he kept twisting about, yet did not stir from the spot. The rain poured, and not a creature could be seen in the street. The porter's bell he was unable to reach, and however was he to get loose? He foresaw that he should have to stay there till morning, and then they must send for a smith to file away the iron bars, and that would be a work of time. All the charity children would just be going to school, and all the sailors who inhabited that quarter of town would be there to see him standing in the pillory. What a crowd there would be!
"Ha ha!"
he cried.
"The blood is rushing to my head, and I shall go mad. I believe I am crazy already. Oh, I wish I were free. Then all these sensations would pass off."
This is just what he ought to have said at first. The moment he had expressed the thought, his head was free. He started back, quite bewildered with fright which the Galoshes of Fortune had caused him. But we must not suppose it was all over. No, indeed, there was worse to come yet. The night passed and the whole of the following day, but no one sent for the galoshes. In the evening, a declamatory performance was to take place at the amateur theater in a distant street. The house was crowded. Among the audience was the young volunteer from the hospital, who seemed to have quite forgotten his adventures of the previous evening. He had on the galoshes. They had not been sent for, and as the streets were still very dirty, they were of great service to him. A new poem entitled "My Aunt's Spectacles" was being recited. It described these spectacles as possessing a wonderful power. If anyone put them on in a large assembly, the people appeared like cards, and the future events of ensuing years could be easily foretold by them. The idea struck him that he should very much like to have such a pair of spectacles, for, if used rightly, they would perhaps enable him to see into the hearts of people, which he thought would be more interesting than to know what was going to happen next year. For future events would be sure to show themselves, but the hearts of people, never.
I can fancy what I should see in the whole row of ladies and gentlemen on the first seat, if I could only look into their hearts. That lady, I imagine, keeps a store for things of all description. How my eyes would wander about in that collection. With many ladies I should no doubt find a large millinery establishment. There is another that is perhaps empty, and would be all the better for cleaning out. There may be some well stored with good articles. Ah, yes, I know one in which everything is solid, but a servant is there already, and that is the only thing against it. I dare say from many I should hear the words, "Please walk in." I only wish I could slip into the hearts like a little tiny thought.
And this was the word of command for the galoshes. The volunteers shrunk up together and commenced a most unusual journey through the hearts of the spectators in the first row. The first heart he entered was that of a lady, but he thought he must have gotten into one of the rooms of an orthopedic institution, where plaster casts of deformed limbs were hanging on the walls, with this difference, that the casts in the institution are formed when the patient enters, but here they were formed and preserved after the good people had left. These were the casts of the bodily and mental deformities of the lady's female friends, carefully preserved. Quickly he passed into another heart, which had the appearance of a spacious, holy church, with the white dove of innocence fluttering over the altar. Gladly he would have fallen on his knees in such a sacred place, but he was carried on to another heart, still, however, listening to the tones of the organ, and feeling himself that he had become another and better man. The next heart was also a sanctuary, which he felt almost unworthy to enter. It represented a mean garret, in which lay a sick mother, but the warm sunshine streamed through her window. Lovely roses bloomed in a little flower box on the roof. 2 bluebirds sang of childlike joys, and the sick mother prayed for a blessing on her daughter. Next he crept on his hands and knees through an overfilled butcher shop. There was meat, nothing but meat, wherever he stepped. This was the heart of a rich, respectable man, whose name is doubtless in the directory. And then he entered the heart of this man's wife. It was an old, tumble-down pigeon house. The husband's portrait served as a weathercock. It was connected with all the doors, which opened and shut just as the husband's decision turned. The next heart was a complete cabinet of mirrors, such as can be seen in the castle of Rosenberg. But these mirrors magnified in an astonishing degree. In the middle of the floor sat like the Grand Lama the insignificance of the owner, astonished at the contemplation of his own features. At his next visit, he fancied he must have gotten into a narrow needle case, full of sharp needles.
"Oh," thought he, "this must be the heart of an old maid."
But such was not the fact. It belonged to a young officer who wore several orders and was said to be a man of intellect and heart. The poor volunteer came out of the last heart in the row quite bewildered. He could not collect his thoughts, and imagined his foolish fancies had carried him away.
"Good gracious," he sighed. "I must have a tendency to softening of the brain, and here it is so exceedingly hot that the blood is rushing to my head."
And then it suddenly recurred to him the strange event of the evening before, when his head had been fixed between the iron railings in front of the hospital.
"This is the cause of it all,"
he exclaimed.
I must do something in time. A Russian bath would be a very good thing to begin with. I wish I were lying on one of the highest shelves."
And sure enough, there he lay on an upper shelf in a vapor bath, still in his evening costume, with his boots and galoshes on, and the hot drops from the ceiling falling on his face.
"Oh-ho!"
he cried, jumping down and rushing towards the plunging bath. The attendant stopped him with a loud cry when he saw the man with all of his clothes on. The volunteer had, however, presence of mind enough to whisper, "It is for a wager." But the first thing he did when he reached his own room was to put a large blister on his neck and another on his back, that his crazy fit might be cured. The next morning his back was very sore, which was all he gained by the Galoshes of Fortune. The Clerk's Transformation. The watchman, whom we of course have not forgotten, thought, after a while, of the galoshes which he had found and taken to the hospital. So he went and fetched them, but neither the lieutenant nor anyone in the street could recognize them as their own, so he gave them up to the police.
"They look exactly like my own galoshes,"
said one of the clerks, examining the unknown articles as they stood by the side of his own.
"It will require even more than the eye of a shoemaker to know one pair from the other." "Master Clerk, Master Clerk,"
said a servant who entered with some papers. The clerk turned and spoke to the man, but when he had done with him, he turned to look at the galoshes again, and now he was in greater doubt than ever as to whether the pair on the right or on the left belonged to him.
"Those that are wet must be mine,"
thought he, but he thought wrong. It was just the reverse. The Galoshes of Fortune were the wet pair, and besides, why should not a clerk in his police office be wrong sometimes? So he drew them on, thrust his papers into his pocket, placed a few manuscripts under his arm, which he had to take with him and to make abstracts from at home. And then, as it was Sunday morning and the weather was very fine, he said to himself,
"A walk to Fredericksburg will do me good."
So away he went. There could not be a quieter or more steady young man than this clerk. We will not grudge him this little walk. It was just the thing to do him good after sitting so much. He went on at first like a mere automaton, without thought or wish, and therefore the galoshes had no opportunity to display their magic power. In the avenue he met with an acquaintance, one of our young poets, who told him that he intended to start on the following day on a summer excursion.
"Are you really going away soon?"
asked the clerk.
"What a free and happy man you are! You can roam about where you will, while such as we are tied by the foot."
"But it is fastened to the bread tree," replied the poet. "You need have no anxiety for the marrow, and when you are old, there's a pension for you."
"Oh, yes, but you have the best of it,"
said the clerk.
"It must be so delightful to sit and write poetry. The whole world makes itself agreeable to you, and then you are your own master. You should try how you would like to listen to all the trivial things in the court of justice."
The poet shook his head. So also did the clerk. Each retained his own opinion, and so they parted.
"They are strange people, these poets,"
thought the clerk.
"I should like to try what it is to have a poetic taste, and to become a poet myself. I'm sure I should not write such mournful verses as they do. This is a splendid spring day for a poet, and the air is so remarkably clear. The clouds are so beautiful, and the green grass has such a sweet smell. For many years I have not felt as I do at this moment."
We perceive by these remarks that he had already become a poet. By most poets, what he had said would be considered commonplace, or as the Germans call it, insipid. It is a foolish fancy to look upon poets as different to other men. There are many who are more the poets of nature than those who are professed poets. The difference is this: the poet's intellectual memory is better. He seizes upon an idea or a sentiment until he can embody it clearly and plainly in words, which the others cannot do. But the transition from a character of everyday life to one of a more gifted nature is a great transition, and so the clerk became aware of the change after a time.
"What a delightful perfume," said he. "It reminds me of the violets at Aunt Laura's. Ah, that was when I was a little boy. Dear me, how long it seems since I've thought of those days. She was a good old lady maiden. She lived yonder, behind the exchange. She always had a sprig or a few blossoms in water, let the winter be ever so severe. I could smell the violets even when I was placing warm penny pieces against the frozen panes to make peepholes, and a pretty view it was on which I peeped. Out in the river lay the ships, ice-bound and forsaken by their crews. A screaming crow represented the only creature on board, but when the breezes of spring came, everything started into life. Amid shouting and cheers, the ships were tarred and rigged, and then they sailed to foreign lands. I remain here, and always shall remain, sitting at my post at the police office, and letting others take passports to distant lands. Yes, this is my fate." And he sighed deeply. Suddenly he paused. "Good gracious, what has come over me? I've never felt before as I do now. It must be the air of spring. It is overpowering, and yet it is delightful."
He felt in his pockets for some of his papers.
"These will give me something else to think of," said he.
Casting his eyes on the first page of one, he read,
"Mistress Sigbert, an original tragedy, in 5 acts. What is this? In my own handwriting, too. Have I written this tragedy?"
He read again,
"The Intrigue on the Promenade, or The Fast Day, of Vaudeville. However did I get all this? Someone must have put them into my pocket. And here is a letter."
It was from the manager of a theater. The pieces were all rejected, not at all in polite terms.
said he, sitting down on a bench.
His thoughts were very elastic, and his heart softened strangely. Involuntarily, he seized one of the nearest flowers. It was a little, simple daisy. All that botanists can say in many lectures was explained in a moment by this little flower. It spoke of the glory of its birth. It told of the strength of the sunlight, which had caused its delicate leaves to expand, and given to it such sweet perfume. The struggles of life which arose sensations in the bosom had their type in this tiny flower. Air and light are the lovers of the flowers, but light is the favored one. Towards light it turns, and only when light vanishes does it fold its leaves together and sleep in the embraces of the air.
"It is light that adorns me," said the flower. "But the air of life gives you the breath of life," whispered the poet.
Just by him stood a boy, splashing with his stick in a marshy ditch. The water drops spurted up among the green twigs, and the clerk thought of the millions of animalculae which were thrown into the air with every drop of water, at a height which must be the same to them as it would be to us if we were hurled beyond the clouds. As the clerk thought of all these things, and became conscious of the great change in his own feelings, he smiled, and he said to himself, "I must be asleep and dreaming, and yet, if so, how wonderful for a dream to be so natural and real, and to know at the same time, too, that it is but a dream. I hope I shall be able to remember it all when I wake tomorrow. My sensations seem most unaccountable. I have a clear perception of everything, as if I were wide awake.
I am quite sure if I recollect all this tomorrow, it will appear utterly ridiculous and absurd. I have had this happen to me before. It is with the clever or wonderful things we say or hear in dreams, as with the gold which comes from under the earth. It is rich and beautiful when we possess it, but when seen in the true light, it is but as stones and withered leaves. Ah,
he sighed mournfully as he gazed at the birds singing merrily or hopping from branch to branch.
They are so much better off than I. Flying is a glorious power. Happy is he who is born with wings. Yes, if I could change myself into anything, I would be a little lark, yeah.
At that same moment, his coat-tails and sleeves grew together and formed wings. His clothes changed to feathers, and his galoshes to claws. He felt what was taking place and laughed to himself.
Well, now it is evident that I must be dreaming, but I never had such a wild dream as this.
And then he flew up into the green boughs and sang, but there was no poetry in the song, for his poetic nature had left him. The galoshes, like all persons who wished to do a thing thoroughly, could only attend to one thing at a time. He wished to be a poet, and he became one, and then he wanted to be a little bird, and in this change he lost the characteristics of the former one.
Well, thought he, this is charming. By day I sit in a police office amongst the driest law papers, and at night I can dream that I am a lark, flying about in the gardens of Fredericksburg. Really, a complete comedy could be written about it.
Then he flew down into the grass, turned his head about in every direction, and tapped his beak on the bending blades of grass, which, in proportion to his size, seemed to him as long as the palm leaves in northern Africa. In another moment all was darkness around him. It seemed as if something immense had been thrown over him. A sailor boy had flung his large cap over the bird, and a hand came underneath it and caught the clerk by the back and wings so roughly that he squeaked and then cried out in his alarm,
"You impudent rascal! I'm the clerk in the police office!"
But it only sounded to the boy like tweet tweet, so he tapped the bird on the beak and walked away with him. In the avenue he met two schoolboys who appeared to belong to a better class of society, but whose inferior abilities kept them in the lowest class at school. These boys bought the bird for 8 pence, and so the clerk returned to Copenhagen.
It is well for me that I am dreaming, he thought. Otherwise I shall become really angry. First I was a poet, and now I am a lark. It must have been the poetic nature that changed me into this little creature. It is a miserable story indeed, especially now I have fallen into the hands of boys. I wonder what will be the end of it.
The boys carried him into a very elegant room, where a stout, pleasant-looking lady received them, but she was not at all gratified to find that they had brought a lark, a common field bird as she called it. However, she allowed them for one day to place the bird in an empty cage that hung near the window.
"It will please Polly, perhaps," she said,
laughing at the large gray parrot, who was swinging himself proudly on a ring in a handsome brass cage.
"It's Polly's birthday," she added in a simpering tone, "and the little field bird has come to offer his congratulations."
Polly did not answer a single word. He continued to swing proudly to and fro, but a beautiful canary, who had been brought from his own warm, fragrant fatherland the summer previous, began to sing as loud as he could.
"You screamer,"
said the lady, throwing a white handkerchief over the cage.
"Tweet, tweet, tweet," sighed he. "What a dreadful snowstorm!"
And then he became silent. The clerk, or as the lady called him, the field bird, was placed in a little cage close to the canary and not far from the parrot. The only human speech which Polly could utter, and which she sometimes chattered forth most comically, was,
"Now let us be men! Now let us be men!"
All besides that was a scream, quite as unintelligible as the warbling of a canary bird, except to the clerk, who, being now a bird, could understand his comrades very well.
"I flew beneath the green palm trees and amidst the blooming almond trees,"
said the canary.
"I flew with my brothers and sisters over beautiful flowers and across the clear bright sea, which reflected the waving foliage in its glittering depths. And I have seen many gay parrots who could relate long and delightful stories." "They were wild birds,"
answered the parrot.
"and totally uneducated. Now let us be men. Why do you not laugh? If the lady and her visitors can laugh at this, surely you can. It is a great failing not to be able to appreciate what is amusing. Now let us be men. Let us be men." "Do you remember," said the canary, "the pretty maidens who used to dance in the tents that were spread out beneath the sweet blossoms? Do you remember the delicious fruit and the cooling juice from the wild herbs?" "Oh, yes," said the parrot. "But here I am much better off, and I am well fed and treated politely. I know that I have a clever head, and what more do I want? Let us be men now. Let us be men. You have a soul for poetry. I have a deep knowledge and wit. You have a genius, but no discretion. You raise your naturally high notes so much that you get covered over. They never served me so. Oh, no! I cost them something more than you. I keep them in order with my beak and fling my wit about me. Now, let us be men." "Oh, my warm blooming fatherland," sang the canary bird, "I will sing of thy dark green trees and thy quiet streams, where the bending branches kiss the clear, smooth water. I will sing of the joy of my brothers and sisters, as their shining plumage fits among the dark leaves of the plants which grow wild by the springs." "Do leave off those dismal strains," said the parrot. "Sing something to make us laugh. Laughter is a sign of the highest order of intellect. Can a dog or a horse laugh? No, they can cry, but to man alone is the power of laughter given." "Ha ha 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 ha!" laughed Polly, and repeated his witty saying. "Now let us be men." "You little gray Danish bird," said the canary, "you also have become a prisoner. It is certainly cold in your forests, but still there is liberty there. Fly out. They have forgotten to close the cage, and the window is open at the top. Fly! Fly!"
Instinctively, the clerk obeyed and left the cage. At the same moment, the half-open door leading into the next room creaked on its hinges, and stealthily, with green fiery eyes, the cat crept in and chased the lark around the room. The canary bird fluttered in his cage, and the parrot flapped his wings and cried, "Let us be men! Let us be men!" The poor clerk, in the most deadly terror, flew through the window, over the houses, and through the streets, till at length he was obliged to seek a resting place. A house opposite to him had a look of home. A window stood open. He flew in and perched upon the table. It was his own room.
"Let us be men now,"
said he, involuntarily imitating the parrot, and at the same moment he became a clerk again, only that he was sitting on the table.
"Heaven preserve us," he said. "How did I get up here and fall asleep in this way? It was an uneasy dream, too, that I had. This whole affair appears most absurd."
The best thing the galoshes did. Early on the following morning, while the clerk was still in bed, his neighbor, a young divinity student who longed on the same story, knocked at his door and then walked in.
"Lend me your galoshes," said he. "It is so wet in the garden, but the sun is shining brightly. I should like to go out there and smoke my pipe."
He put on the galoshes and was soon in the garden, which contained only one plum tree and one apple tree. Yet in a town, even a small garden like this is a great advantage. The student wandered up and down the path. It was just 6 o'clock, and he could hear the sound of the post horn in the street.
"Oh, to travel, cried he. "There is no greater happiness in the world. It is the height of my ambition. This restless feeling would be stilled if I could take a journey far away from this country. I should like to see beautiful Switzerland, to travel through Italy, and—"
It was well for him that the galoshes acted immediately. Otherwise, he might have been carried too far for himself, as well as for all of us. In a moment he found himself in Switzerland, closely packed with 8 others in the diligence. His head ached, his back was stiff, and the blood had ceased to circulate, so that his feet were swelled and pinched by his boots. He wavered in a condition between sleeping and waking. In his right-hand pocket he had a letter of credit. In his left-hand pocket was his passport, and a few louis d'ors were sewn into the little leather bag which he carried in his breast pocket. Whenever he dozed, he dreamed that he had lost one or another of these possessions. Then he would awake with a start, and the first movements of his hand formed a triangle from his right-hand pocket to his breast, and from his breast to his left-hand pocket to feel whether they were all safe. Umbrellas, sticks, and hats swung in the net before him and almost obstructed the prospect, which was really very imposing, and as he glanced at it, his memory recalled the words of one poet at least, who had sung of Switzerland, and whose poems have not yet been printed. "How lovely to my wandering eyes Mont Blanc's fair summits gently rise! 'Tis sweet to breathe the mountain air, if you have gold enough to spare." Grand, dark, and gloomy appeared the landscape around him. The pine forests looked like little groups of moss on high rocks, whose summits were lost in clouds of mist. Presently it began to snow, and the wind blew keen and cold.
"Ah," he sighed, "if I were only on the other side of the Alps now, it would be summer, and I should be able to get money on my letter of credit. The anxiety I feel on this matter prevents me from enjoying myself in Switzerland. Oh, I wish I was on the other side of the Alps."
And there, in a moment, he found himself far away in the midst of Italy, between Florence and Rome, where Lake Trasimene glittered in the evening sunlight like a sheet of molten gold between the dark blue mountains. There, where Hannibal defeated Flaminius, the grapevines clung to each other with the friendly grasp of their green tendril fingers, while by the wayside, lovely half-naked children were watching a herd of coal-black swine under the blossoms of fragrant laurel. Could we rightly describe this picturesque scene, our readers would exclaim, "Oh, delightful Italy!" But neither the student nor either of his traveling companions felt the least inclination to think of it in this way. Poisonous flies and gnats flew into the coach by thousands. In vain they drove them away with a myrtle branch. The flies stung them notwithstanding. There was not a man in the coach whose face was not swollen and disfigured with the stings. The poor horses looked wretched. The flies settled on their backs in swarms, and they were only relieved when the coachman got down and drove the creatures off. As the sun set, an icy coldness filled all nature, not however of long duration. It produced the feeling which we experience when we enter a vault at a funeral on a summer's day. while the hills and the clouds put on that singular green hue which we often notice in old paintings and look upon as unnatural until we have ourselves seen nature's coloring in the south. It was a glorious spectacle, but the stomachs of the travelers were empty, their bodies exhausted with fatigue, and all the longings of their heart turned towards a resting place for the night. But where to find one they knew not. All the eyes were too eagerly seeking for this resting place to notice the beauties of nature. The road passed through a grove of olive trees. It reminded the student of the willow trees at home. Here stood a lonely inn, and close by it a number of crippled beggars had placed themselves. The brightest among them looked, to quote the words of Marriott, like the eldest son of famine who had just come of age. The others were either blind or had withered legs, which obliged them to creep about on their hands and knees, or they had shriveled arms and hands without fingers. It was indeed poverty arrayed in rags.
"Excellenza, miserabili!"
they exclaimed, stretching forth their diseased limbs. The hostess received the travelers with bare feet, untidy hair, and a dirty blouse. The doors were fastened together with string. The floors of the rooms were of brick, broken in many places, and bats flew about under the roof. And as to the odor within,
"Let's have the supper laid on the table,"
said one of the travelers.
"Then we shall know what we are breathing."
The windows were open to let in a little fresh air, but quicker than air came in the withered arms and the continual whining sounds.
"Miserabilia, Excellenza!"
On the walls were inscriptions, half of them against La Bella Italia. The supper made its appearance at last. It consisted of watery soup, seasoned with pepper and rancid oil. This last delicacy played a principal part in the salad. Musty eggs and roasted coxcombs were the best dishes on the table. Even the wine had a strange taste. It was certainly a mixture. At night, all the boxes were placed against the doors, and one of the travelers watched while the others slept. The student's turn came to watch. How close the air felt in that room. The heat overpowered him. The gnats were buzzing about and stinging, while the miserabili outside moaned in their dreams.
"Traveling would be all very well,"
said the student of divinity to himself,
"if we had no bodies, or if the body could rest while the soul is flying. Wherever I go, I feel a want which oppresses my heart, for something better presents itself at the moment. Yes, something better, which shall be the best of all, but where is that to be found? In fact, I know in my heart very well what I want. I wish to attain the greatest of all happiness." No sooner were the words spoken than he was at home. Long white curtains shaded the windows of his room, and in the middle of the floor stood a black coffin, in which he now lay in the still sleep of death. His wish was fulfilled, his body was at rest, and his spirit traveling. "Esteem no man happy until he is in his grave," were the words of Solon. Here was a strong, fresh proof of their truth. Every corpse is a sphinx of immortality. The sphinx in this sarcophagus might unveil its own mystery in the words which the living had himself written 2 days before. "Stern death, thy chilling silence waketh dread, yet in thy darkest hour there may be light. Earth's garden reaper, from the grave's cold bed, the soul on Jacob's ladder takes her flight. Man's greatest sorrows often are a part of hidden griefs concealed from human eyes, which press far heavier on the lonely heart than now the earth that on his coffin lies." 2 figures were moving about the room. We know them both. One was the fairy named Care,
and the other the messenger of fortune. They bent over the dead.
"Look," said Care, "what happiness have your galoshes brought to mankind?" "They have at least brought a lasting happiness to him who slumbers here," she said. "Not so," said Care. "He went away of himself. He was not summoned. His mental powers were not strong enough to discern the treasures which he had been destined to discover. I will do him a favor now."
And she drew the galoshes from his feet. The sleep of death was ended, and the recovered man raised himself. Care vanished, and with her the galoshes. Doubtless she looked upon them as her own property. The Wicked Prince. There lived once upon a time a wicked prince, whose heart and mind were set upon conquering all the countries of the world, and on frightening the people. He devastated their countries with fire and sword, and his soldiers trod down the crops in the fields, and destroyed the peasants' huts by fire, so that the flames licked the green leaves off of the branches, and the fruit hung dried up on the singed black trees. Many a poor mother fled, her naked baby in her arms, behind the still smoking walls of her cottage, but also there the soldiers followed her, and when they found her, she was served as new nourishment to their diabolical enjoyments. Demons could not have possibly done worse things than these soldiers. The prince was of opinion that all this was right, and it was only the natural course which things ought to take. His power increased day by day, and his name was feared by all, and fortune favored his deeds. He brought enormous wealth home from the conquered towns, and gradually accumulated in his residence riches which could nowhere be equaled. He erected magnificent palaces, churches, and halls, and all who saw these splendid buildings and great treasures exclaimed admiringly, "What a mighty prince!" But they did not know what endless misery he had brought upon other countries, nor did they hear the sighs and lamentations which rose up from the debris of the destroyed cities. The prince often looked with delight upon his gold and his magnificent edifices, and thought like the crowd, "What a mighty prince! But I must have more, much more. No power on earth must equal mine, far less exceed it." He made war with all of his neighbors, and defeated them. The conquered kings were chained up with golden fetters to his chariot when he drove through the streets of his city. These kings had to kneel at the side of his courtiers' feet when they sat at table, and live on the morsels in which they left. At last, the prince had his own statue erected on the public places and fixed on the royal places. Nay, he even wished it to be placed in the churches, on the altars, but in this the priests opposed him, saying,
"Prince, you are mighty indeed, but God's power is much greater than yours. We dare not obey your orders."
"Well," said the prince,
"then I will conquer God too."
And in his haughtiness and foolish presumption he ordered a magnificent ship to be constructed, with which he could sail through the air. It was gorgeously fitted out and of many colors, like the tail of a peacock. It was covered with thousands of eyes, but each eye was the barrel of a gun. The prince sat in the center of the ship, and had only to touch a spring in order to make thousands of bullets fly out in all directions, while the guns were at once loaded again. Hundreds of eagles were attached to this ship, and it rose with the swiftness of an arrow up towards the sun. The earth was soon left far below, and looked, with its mountains and woods, like a cornfield where the plow had made furrows which separated green meadows. Soon it looked only like a map with indistinct lines upon it, and at last it entirely disappeared in mist and clouds. Higher and higher rose the eagles up into the air, and then God sent one of his numberless angels against the ship. The wicked prince showered thousands of bullets upon him, but they rebounded from his shining wings and fell down like ordinary hailstones. One drop of blood, one single drop, came out of the white feathers of the angel's wings and fell upon the ship in which the prince sat, burnt into it, and weighed upon it like thousands of hundredweights, dragging it rapidly down to the earth again. The strong wings of the eagles gave way. The wind roared around the prince's head, and the clouds around. Were they formed by the smoke rising from the burnt cities? They took strange shapes, like crabs many, many miles long, which stretched their claws out after him, and rose up like enormous rocks, from which rolling masses dashed down, and became fire-spitting dragons. The prince was lying half dead in his ship, when it sank at last with a terrible shock into the branches of a large tree in the wood.
"I will conquer God," said the prince. "I have sworn it. My will must be done."
And he spent 7 years in the construction of wonderful ships to sail through the air, and had darts cast from the hardest steel to break the walls of heaven with. He gathered warriors from all countries, so many that when they were placed side by side, they covered the space of several miles. They entered the ships, and the prince was approaching his own, when God sent a swarm of gnats, one swarm of little gnats. They buzzed round the prince and stung his face and hands. Angrily, he drew his sword and brandished it, but he only touched the air and did not hit the gnats. Then he ordered his servants to bring costly coverings and wrap him in them, that the gnats might no longer be able to reach him. The servants carried out his orders, but one single gnat had placed itself inside one of the coverings, crept into the prince's ear, and stung him. The place burnt like fire, and the poison entered into his blood. Mad with pain, he tore off the coverings and his clothes too, flinging them far away, and he danced about before the eyes of his ferocious soldiers, who now mocked him, the mad prince who wishes to make war with God, and was overcome by a single gnat. Wow. So, we're just now realizing that some of these stories are a half an hour long or more, even if reading at a brisk pace. So, for future episodes, you may only have 1 or 2 stories, but that should be alright, as long as you're willing to let go and listen to the tales. We hope that you've enjoyed Volume 4 of the Fairy Tales of Hans Christian Andersen. Take care of yourselves out there. Sweet dreams.